Hey everyone, welcome to another awesome episode. Today I've got Cate Lawrence, a veteran tech journalist who I have been following her work for quite some time, meaning several years already, from the time that she used to write for the Next Web, and now she's writing for Tech EU, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So
That's to be here.
yeah, thank you so much for being here. You're currently in Berlin, so just
Correct.
so the audience know, we're doing this not as a video, but audio only. I have some internet issues, so it's my fault completely. Um, there's a ton of things I wanted to ask you and kind of talk to you about.
Absolutely.
My first question is, you know, ChatGPT, is taking over the world.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on ChatGPT right now?
It would be really easy for me to say, oh, look, we've got a party trick that's just, for fooling around. But I'm seeing not only startups or established companies that are leveraging Chat GPT or just GPT or Stable Diffusion or a variation of some sort, open source or otherwise, to either expand their product offerings or new companies that are starting out from the get-go and they're using it as a way to create new tech that I would phrase that new proprietary tech. So they've kind of taken some of those open source elements of generative AI and they've added their own sort of technology within to create new products that are solving industry challenges. So it's more profound and it's actually faster than I was anticipating, which I think is really interesting.
As a writer, well, what do you think about it as a writer? Usually, writers had to be just people who really do like deep research on topics,
Mm.
kind of come up with their own angle. And now it seems like ChatGPT has a great, are showing great results, but mostly showing great results in like more the evergreen type of content. I
Mm.
wouldn't say they can write articles like a tech journalist can, not now, anyways.
Mm.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. Look, we've looked at it at TechEU because we're as interested as everybody else, and whereas we've got as much pressure as every other publication on the planet to produce lots of content, and we've tried it out for the more kind of roundup listicle style articles. Here's 10 companies doing X, and it may be able to list give you 10 companies from, say, a particular region or a particular country, give you a little synopsis. It's just not very interesting. It's just dry kind of stuff. It doesn't necessarily give you a color or a feel, particularly if you're looking at something, say, the same sector. Say you're looking at, I don't know, pet tech for sake of argument, and you're going to list 10 companies that are doing mobile veterinarian services. It won't compare and contrast those. Well, not that I've seen so far, as in that sense. So it won't really give you those interesting bits that make startups interesting. Is there an interesting origin story? Is there a competitive advantage? Is there something? Maybe it's a notable client. Maybe there's I don't know, someone who's name checked the company. Something that's a little out of the ordinary, or that makes a story more interesting than just facts.
hmm I think now we have GPT-4.
Mm.
Obviously I think it took them like 4 months to jump
Yeah,
from like GPT-3 or 3.5 to 4. So
exactly.
so it means that like in maybe 2 or 3 years we're gonna be probably like GPT-15,
You agree?
right? Or something like that, maybe GPT-12. And I'm thinking like, how powerful do you think GPT-12 or GPT-15 will be? Do you think they will be able to make that subtle,
Mm-hmm.
nuances in the writing?
Sure. I mean, let's face it, this tech the growth is exponential. It's beyond what, it's kind of that, Moore's law kind of idea of, creating a tech that's not only replicated the, 4 by 4 of what something can do, it's 1,000 by 4. Um, but I mean, it also will be, it will depend. I mean, on in terms of applicability. I know there's already some publications that are, for example, screening quotes. So if a source emails quotes for something, or also PR agencies doing this, they want to make sure those quotes haven't been generated by ChatGPT or a comparable service. So, the people are skeptical. I would imagine there are unions, work unions, that are skeptical. But when it comes to something like maybe copywriting or journalism, where there's a large freelance or contractual workforce, it's probably more of a challenge because there's less checks and balances in the more, I guess, the smaller publications. But it's also, there's less of a critical body to maybe set standards and create, like, what's the ethical framework about this? How do you use these tools responsibly in a way that it's not plagiarizing, which is a big part of tech, let's face it. But it's also factually correct. So because, facts are important, but it's also nuanced. So maybe we're looking at offering opinions. The idea that tech would be replaced by soft skills and all this kind of stuff, maybe that's the side of it that will come in, more kind of analysis, which is based on, like, me knowing, I don't know, one example, me knowing a company that did something comparable that maybe GPT doesn't know. Maybe it does. I think we're going to have to work some of this stuff out as we go. And I think it's going to be probably, I kind of think it's exciting. I think there's a lot of exciting things, particularly in areas like of generative AI, like filmmaking and drug discovery and stuff like that. But I think it will also be challenging in terms of applicability.
In your case, in terms of like the editors and in tech EU, do they encourage you guys to add some nuance of ChatGPT generated content for like productivity purposes into the articles you guys are writing, or is it completely like frowned upon?
No, not at all. I mean, I think we've all tried it because we're curious. And that's part of this work. You're curious about stuff and you like to try it out, particularly if it promises an easy user interface, which is, very appealing. Let's face it. If something's easy to use, you're more likely to use it. There's been no censorship of it. I think the issue would be something like if there is an article generated entirely by ChatGPT or a comparable service, who's the author? What do you put as the author? Doesn't matter. I know ethically I wouldn't feel comfortable about it, and I have tried. For example, I pulled out, and it was just curiosity. It was no sinister intent. I pulled out an interview that I'd done with somebody. I put it through to see and said, make this into an article or something to that effect. And it was okay. It just wasn't very. Again, it was a little dull. It didn't
have that human emotion, human connection inside that. Yeah.
And look, maybe that's what these tools are for. It's for getting maybe a cursory framework or the bare bones where you could add that color and that the bits that make something interesting. And is that a bad thing? I don't think it is. I guess it depends your stance on this, and maybe your listeners have their own thoughts that, because I think we're working on this as we go. And let's face it, in media, this is not new. Bloomberg, MSN News, Yahoo News have been using these tools and built their own tools for probably a decade.
So like Bloomberg, they have been using specifically AI generation tools?
Yeah, basically for again, that kind of straight reporting. I think it's stuff like, I know some sites use it for things like maybe a stock exchange report, or say you're reporting what happened at a basketball game, where it's very kind of factual. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. So that kind of stuff. I'm assuming someone checks it, but I don't know.
Now they're probably scared because now people can use detection tools, and they're gonna be, wow, like 90% of the articles here are actually AI generated and have been AI generated for years, right? Like without people knowing. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because I've got friends that are copywriters, and it's a fairly common job for an English speaker in Berlin who comes here and doesn't necessarily have a lot of transferable skills or speak the language to do something like copywriting and do the lower paid stuff. where you think my first thought was, oh, this guy's going to be replaced by something like ChatGPT. And then they have to explicitly sign contracts that say that they do not use any of these tools or they lose their job immediately. So people are setting standards, and I think this may vary across different sectors. And, I don't know what this would mean, for example, if you're doing a research paper where you need that peer review, you need that academic rigor, versus, I don't know, a website or something like that. I think it's going to vary.
That is so interesting. The thing you said about the copywriting thing, I'll tell you why. Because like the advancement of like AI and generative AI is to help, at the end of the day, you wanted to help people. You wanted to help productivity.
Exactly.
And if copywriters are not going to be able to use it, then who is going to use it? Because reporters are not going to use it. Novelists are not going to use it because it, like we said, it doesn't have that human connection or human feel. And even if it does, people will know it has been written by AI. Then even copywriters are not going to be able to use it. Then who is it for? That's like, what do you think? Like, who is going to use it? Who is going to scale this? Who is going to, use it into their mainstream day-to-day work?
Yeah, particularly if you're talking commercial product offerings.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm seeing people using it in things like storyboarding, for example, generative AI and storyboarding for film scripts, where they're taking a film script and they're being able to do a 3D visual element of parts of the film. And it's obviously not to make a film. It's there for planning purposes. So maybe where do you put you put the character on the screen? Which side of the sofa are they on, or the couch or something? Those sorts of things. And so there's been, there's a lot of good use cases, but I think we're still really working out which ones will stick. And they might not be the ones we think of as well. There could be use cases that we don't see now as we're talking, that in 10 years or maybe even two years could be, the mainstay.
I want to ask you some more kind of personal questions on your career, and kind of like what I've seen from from outside is, so you've been managed to build like a really nice platform for yourself on the next web. I'm also talking about the newsletter, the shift, right? That was the name. And I've been really impressed by the work you've done over there, and by everything you've managed to build over there. And I was actually really surprised that you just transitioned to a different publication. I would love to know, like, what's your take on that? Why did you feel like you needed to make that move?
Well, I mean, before TNW, the next web, I had worked for a lot of publications. I'd worked primarily in the IoT space, so writing about IoT and then industrial IoT. I'd also written for an industrial IoT venture capital advisory firm, and done a lot of kind of, blog posts and newsletters and white papers and things like that. And originally had taken the role at TNW because I'd got to that point where during the pandemic, 4 of my clients, which included some trade publications I wrote for, had closed down because they were no longer able to stay solvent. So that shows you, this is quite common in the media. People often underestimate the job cuts that happen quite readily. It's not as secure a profession as people think, or I think everyone knows that now. And TNW was not immune to those sorts of cuts. There'd already been a lot of cuts before I started, and also while I was there. And, it was just an opportunity came up to do something different. I'd spent a lot of time at TNW working in the mobility space, which I really liked. But, tech is always moving and evolving, and you never want to stay in one spot because firstly, you can get very, you can kind of get stuck somewhere, and I think if you build all your knowledge in one space, it makes it hard to transition to other areas. So I had a lot of other things I was interested in learning about, and one of the advantages of coming to TechEU and being able to work as a features writer was that I was able to kind of choose my topics that I wanted to focus on, I guess. So, I was intentionally sort of choosing things where I may not know that much either. So it was about, let's build some knowledge and find some interesting things for the readers as well that can bring them some value. So things like prop tech, I didn't know that much about before I started looking into it. Writing about things like biopharmaceutical science and stuff like that. It's a really good opportunity.
Amazing. I'm happy for you. You did become some sort of a mobility influencer, but
I don't know. I think it's more so because there's not a lot of women writing about mobility, to be honest. At the one thing we did have at TNW was our mobility team was 2 women, and that's not unusual.
So, you mentioned job cuts. You mentioned, media not being the safe industry.
100%.
Yeah. What's the future? What's the future in terms of media? We're seeing platforms like Substack that I'm a big advocate for. I'm also a big advocate for, platforms like LinkedIn, where you can basically reach such a big audience, and you can reach it on kind of like on your terms. What do you think is the next big thing in media? Do you think being a writing for publications is going to be, sought after in about 5 or 10 years? Or do you think we're going to shift, writers are going to shift to different kind of platforms?
Honestly, I think it will never be one thing. I think it will constantly evolve and shift and change. I think what will remain constant is the way people consume the media, which is largely going to be on a mobile phone. So the days where someone sits at their laptop and reads an article end to end are not so prevalent, unless that's part of your job, of course. I always think of it can someone read this when they're standing up on a tram, with one hand, because, and so you want something scrollable, you want something that's digestible where possible. I mean, sometimes you do need to do those bigger deep dives. I know, I'm guilty of that as well. So I try and balance it out. So I think that, that's definitely one thing. People also want long form. It switches back and forth. One day I hear people saying, white papers are dead. No one wants this sort of stuff. But then I talk to marketing people who say, this is a very valuable tool in our toolbox for marketing and for promotion and for research, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's never going to be one thing. I think obviously podcasts will remain a constant. And, we have a podcast, for example, at TechEU that is quite popular, and it's a bit of fun as well. We make it light, but we make it interesting where we can interview different people, things like that, of course. But, and then, of course, we've got this thing now where people are going back to conferences. So I think all of us got a bit of an online fatigue or a Zoom fatigue from doing online events and conferences and, meetups and things like that. It got pretty grim after a while to going and doing things in person. And that's where often you're making those connections and you're building things. And I might add, if we take it back to that sort of generative AI stuff or ChatGPT, that's often where you're picking up things that, those kind of engines or learning models or libraries won't necessarily know. So sometimes there's those sorts of interesting interactions as well.
What is your writing process like these days? I'm really interested in the technical details. How do you structure an article? How long does it take you? Kind of take us through that process.
Yeah, it varies, to be honest. It depends on, how much I'm going to put into it, how many people I've interviewed, for example. So I'll give you an example, a piece I published yesterday, which was looking at a scam, basically, which is a funding announcement of a fictitious startup getting $116 million in funding from a hedge fund. and the startup didn't actually exist. They had actually plagiarized their website content from another startup, established startup. So in that instance, I interviewed the person who originally realized the scam, who was a PR person, and the original company that was plagiarized. He was a client. They were his client, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry. I also interviewed a VC to get their take on it, because it's like, well, you're the ones doing due diligence and all this sort of stuff. Like, how do you pick up on this sort of stuff? And what is the end game in these kinds of scams where, it's a bizarre story. And I encourage people, if you want a weird read, look it up, because it's kind of weird. But then there was often it's little bits of research. So it's looking at, okay, if I'm mentioning companies, have we mentioned them? Have other people mentioned them? With this story, it was things like looking at reverse image searches, because they were looking at people that were listed as company founders that didn't actually exist. So
that's crazy.
Their photos were used in photo stock articles, but all kinds of non-related topics and things like that. It was, looking up the person who was alleged to have founded the company, who had already been barred from running companies for previous Ponzi schemes. So honestly, it varies. I mean, you can do it. One thing I will say is that tech has made it much faster to do things like interviews. When I'm going to interview a company, I do some research beforehand, of course. Interview them. I'm able to record it, of course, and transcribe it using software. I use Otter, which most of us use, I think. Super fast. It's more accurate than it used to be. When I first started using these kinds of tools, I was using some software out of Cambridge University. They were kind of trialing it. This is probably 2014 or something. And problem was I was writing about IoT, so Internet of Things, IoT, and the software every time would write coyote, like the wild dog. And if you can imagine how many times you would say IoT in an article about IoT, it was a pain in the ass. And
wow.
The other thing it would do that was pretty annoying was often, when people are talking naturally, you don't always have the same cadence when you're thinking, while you're talking, and you're just kind of pausing. So when someone would pause like this, it would put full stops in between each word. It's like, no. So, I mean, just the fact that those sorts of things have got so much better, that I can speak to someone with a heavy accent they may be speaking in their second or third language, which is English to me. We're transcribing that. We're able to pick up most of what they say, if not all, and turn that around, pick out some notable quotes, look at paraphrasing, of course, taking it back to what's the aim of the article, what why are we doing it, what's the benefit for the reader? Is there something interesting that they want to know about, or something the company's doing that is maybe it's an interesting first, or they're doing it better, or something like that. And then it's it's stuff like pictures. I'd say to any startup out there, we need pictures, particularly if you're doing something that doesn't involve pictures. And it's probably, I think what we said was the best picture of the year recently at Tech EU was a startup who were doing something in I think it was SaaS and cybersecurity from memory, Berlin startup. And while you think, okay, you're not going to have a very good picture, because most cybersecurity articles, you will have something like a photo stock image of a burglar in front of a laptop or something ridiculous like that. But this was actually presumably the founders. They were sitting in like a kind of industrial substation, and posing a certain way with a very old PC, and it was done in a very entertaining way. So if there's ways you can help us bring value to your companies, us writing stories about your companies, things like images, charts. We make a lot of our own charts. We employ a data scientist who does that for us as well. We have a database of mergers and acquisitions and deals and funding rounds, where we get a lot of information from that, which again we turn into graphs and things like that. We do a bit of that, and of course you have to think of a heading. headings is sometimes the hardest thing. And I have actually been playing around with ChatGPT for headings because I'm interested to see what it can do. And it's never given me a heading, but what it does give you is some ideas. So sometimes it's like, well, no, I don't want that, but I like that word. So I think it shows that you can use a tool and make it your own in a different kind of way.
Interesting. You've been super helpful with your time. I have a bit of like a rapid fire questions for you.
Go for it.
Favorite book?
Gosh, that's a hard one. I'm a voracious reader, so it's a very difficult question.
Me too, by the way.
Geez, that's a hard one. I'd have to get back to you.
Okay.
3 or 4 books a week. Yeah.
Well, 3 or 4 a week?
Yeah, I read a lot.
That's insane.
I find it relaxing.
Amazing. Okay, so we'll jump on to the next question. Which type of tech persona is someone that you would pay to interview? Of course, you wouldn't literally pay to interview him, but someone that you would really want to interview, like in terms of a tech persona, that you follow the thing that he's doing, and you're like that he or she is doing, and you're like, hey, I gotta land an interview with that persona.
Yeah, totally. I think it's often someone who's doing something new or different, or they're using tools in a different way. So it doesn't have to be. I'll give you an example. Like, I've written a lot about eVTOLs, which are flying taxis is one example. You've probably heard of that term. So which may or may not be powered by electric batteries, green hydrogen, perhaps some kind of biofuels. So at the moment, we have no companies commercially offering those, but I've been following them for a long time. And well, I've written about it. I've interviewed a bunch of companies over the years doing them. One that really caught my attention was that they found a really interesting way, and I'm still gonna interview them. I spoke to them in Paris at a conference a couple of weeks ago. The way they've kind of got around some of the kind of most onerous regulations, which in terms of where you're allowed to fly and safety and stuff like that, which I might add that the other companies were developing as were creating their aircraft. So it's kind of this dual process. You can imagine how long that takes. Also, they said, well, we're not going to start with commercial flights for either cargo or people. We're going to start with military. So maybe military cargo flights or something around that, because the regulations are different. So I felt that was a really interesting way of, that they weren't, obviously, they will still do all the checks and balances. I'm not suggesting otherwise, not in the slightest, but it was a way of being able to perhaps speed up some of their other activities that would otherwise be spent in a small team or a small leadership team, focusing on a lot of those regulations rather than building their own aircraft.
And in terms of tech personalities like an Elon Musk or a Jack Dorsey, is there someone that you think is really, doing like an amazing job and you would like to get access to?
I would like to speak to the founder of Mastodon. I think that would be interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, they're getting a lot of attention right now since Elon Musk took over Twitter and people have started to leave.
Yeah, because I think why is because there's been a lot of people over the years try and create alternative social media platforms that have failed. Everything from, I guess, something like Peach to maybe Snapshot, if you can call that a failed. Maybe it's still going. So it's about, creating something in this landscape where you're kind of riffing off Discord is super interesting.
What are some writing tools or gadgets or softwares that you use, in your day-to-day work?
Yeah. Let's see. I use honestly, I keep it simple. I think if you're overcomplicating it, I think it's it's a bit like the idea that people who say they're writing spend more time talking about writing than writing. So I'm using Google Docs for writing my content. I'm saving it in the cloud. There's no desktop or anything ridiculous like that. I'm using Grammarly because I'm often flipping between different kinds of grammar. For example, when I worked at T&W, we were writing in American grammar, whereas at Techie, we write in British grammar. So they're quite different. I use things like Evernote just to take notes. I've got a couple of different software tools I use for recording. I've got things for, converting files, like different types of images. I use Canva for making header images. I use things for resizing, a bunch of different stuff, really. I think that's the thing. I mean, I'm not suggesting I use the most, the most sexiest tools there are, but I find tools that I can use without too much trouble. They don't necessarily require really high bandwidth, which may be important if I'm working remotely. Like maybe I'm sitting at the backstage of a conference or something in a loud media room. I don't need a lot of distraction. I need something simple to use. Just tools that you can make work. I mean, I still know lots of journalists who still when they interview someone, they take notes on a piece of paper with a pen and then transcribe. So everyone's got their own working style.
Amazing. Simplicity is king. Simplicity is the way to go.
Yeah.
Cate, you've been fabulous, with giving your precious time to this interview. I really, keep up the good work that you're doing. I think you're an amazing writer, and hopefully we can do another one of those conversations, in the future once we see where ChatGPT is next time.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think it'd be super interesting.
If someone wants to follow sorry, what is that?
We can see what we got wrong.
Exactly. Or maybe also what we got right, hopefully.
That too.
Yeah. So really thank you so much for your time. And for people who want to follow you, you can check out her LinkedIn. Are you on Twitter as well? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm still on Twitter, and I'm on Mastodon. And if you go to Twitter, it's got my email address and my Mastodon link as well, because I can't remember it. So yeah, make it easy. Just go on there.
Yeah, go to LinkedIn. Start from LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Awesome, Cate. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.